What happens when a judge with a sharp tongue and deep bias targets a decorated general in court? The tension boils over, but the twist that follows leaves the entire courtroom stunned, and one man humbled in the most unexpected way. The courtroom felt alive with whispers, low murmurs buzzing like restless bees in a hive. Everyone knew Judge Marshall Banks. He had a reputation for running his courtroom with an iron fist and a sharp tongue, especially when the defendants or witnesses didn't look like him. He'd mastered the art of making people squirm, and today it seemed he had a new target in sight. Seated at the defense table was General Marcus Hamilton. The man was a walking monument to dignity, tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed in his military uniform. His chest was adorned with medals, each one a testament to a lifetime of sacrifice and service. Even in the harsh, fluorescent lighting, the silver and gold decorations gleamed like small suns. It was the kind of presence that should silence a room. But not today. Marcus was here to vouch for a fellow soldier, a young man on trial for something Marcus believed was a clear misunderstanding. He spoke with measured confidence, his deep, resonant voice filling every corner of the room. Sergeant Daniels is one of the finest men I've had the privilege of serving with. His character... Judge Banks cut him off, his voice sharp and clipped. That's enough, General. We're not here for a history lesson. Stick to the facts. The interruption was as deliberate as a slap across the face. Marcus froze for a brief second, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. His composure remained intact, but the air in the room shifted. The murmurs stopped, replaced by a tense silence. Everyone could feel the undercurrent of hostility flowing from the bench. Banks had leaned forward, his thin lips curling into a smirk. "General Hamilton," he began, dragging out the title like it tasted sour. "You're asking us to believe that someone like you, someone from your background, could reach a rank like this? Sounds improbable, to say the least." The insult landed like a grenade, echoing in the stillness. A few heads in the gallery turned toward Marcus, eyes wide, waiting to see how he'd respond. Marcus, ever the professional, met the judge's gaze head-on. He didn't flinch, didn't waver. His voice, steady and deliberate, carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "Your Honor, I didn't come here to defend myself. My record speaks for itself." Banks didn't miss a beat. He leaned back in his oversized chair, a smug grin stretching across his face. "Perhaps it does, for now." The courtroom felt heavy, the kind of weight that makes your chest tighten without warning. Banks continued his veiled attacks, his questions dripping with condescension. "Tell me, General, how does one like you even begin to command troops, or do they just follow orders out of fear?" The crowd couldn't hold back this time. Quiet murmurs exploded into a ripple of gasps, a wave of discomfort spreading through the room. It was one thing to challenge a witness, but this was something else entirely. Even the court stenographer glanced up, her fingers momentarily frozen over the keys. But Marcus? He stayed calm, his demeanor unshaken. He answered every question with precision, his tone never rising, his words never faltering. It wasn't just his discipline that kept him grounded, it was his understanding. He'd faced this kind of bias before. This wasn't new. As the exchange dragged on, though, the unspoken truth became painfully clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. Banks wasn't interrogating Marcus because he doubted his integrity. He was doing it because he could. Marcus stood by the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, his broad shoulders relaxed, but his eyes sharp, scanning the crowd of bustling lawyers and curious onlookers. His attorney, a wiry man with a knack for quiet tenacity, leaned in, whispering strategy points. Marcus nodded occasionally, his face a mask of calm. But inside, the steady drumbeat of frustration was beginning to quicken. He could feel the weight of the morning's exchange with Judge Banks pressing against his composure. Then came the footsteps, measured, deliberate, and unmistakable. Judge Banks, his black robe billowing slightly as he strode past, couldn't resist another swipe. Stopping just short of the exit, he turned toward Marcus, his lips curling into a tight, almost predatory grin. "You know," Banks began, his voice low enough to seem casual but loud enough to be heard by everyone nearby, "I've seen plenty of men like you try to talk their way into respect they don't deserve. Don't be one of them." The words were like a strike of flint against steel, sparking a tension that instantly silenced the surrounding chatter. Marcus turned slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. His height and calm presence made the moment feel larger than life, like the calm before a brewing storm. "Respect isn't given, Judge Banks," Marcus said, his voice steady but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "It's earned." The air froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Witnesses, clerks, and even a few reporters seemed to collectively hold their breath, their eyes darting between the two men like they were courtside at a heavyweight match. Banks's face flushed a deep red, a shade darker than his usual courtroom bravado. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he might walk away. But then, as if some internal sense of superiority kicked in, he straightened his spine and leaned in slightly. "Careful, General," he said, his tone a mix of condescension and barely veiled irritation. "I'd hate to see you ruin that polished image of yours." Marcus didn't flinch. He simply stared, his silence more powerful than any words he could have mustered. That was when it happened. A buzz. Marcus's phone vibrated in his pocket. Pulling it out, he glanced at the screen. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read the notification banner, "Heroic Rescue. General saves civilians during armed robbery." The news alert was short, but its impact was immediate. Marcus's lips pressed together in a faint smile, not one of triumph, but of understanding. He wasn't the only one who'd seen it. The courtroom doors were still open, and a ripple of murmurs began to spread like wildfire. Someone nearby caught sight of their own phone screen and gasped audibly. A reporter near the bench whispered something to their colleague, who immediately pulled out a tablet. Banks noticed the shift. His brow furrowed as his gaze darted around the room, his confidence starting to wobble like a chair missing a leg. Before he could open his mouth again, a voice rang out from the gallery, clear and bold. "Excuse me, Your Honor, but you might want to take a look at this." A young man, holding up his phone like a beacon, stood in defiance of courtroom etiquette. And as if on cue, others followed, lifting their screens to reveal the same breaking news story. The buzz became a hum, the hum became whispers, and the whispers rose into a chorus of audible disbelief and admiration. Banks's head snapped toward the nearest screen, his eyes narrowing as he squinted to read the headline. His smug expression faltered, the confidence evaporating like a puddle under the midday sun. The accompanying video clip began playing on several screens, showing Marcus in civilian clothes, fearlessly stepping into a chaotic robbery to protect innocent bystanders. The footage was clear. Marcus Hamilton wasn't just a decorated soldier, he was a hero, plain and simple. The courtroom erupted into a low roar of conversation. Even the court clerk, usually stone-faced and professional, couldn't hide her astonishment. For the first time, Judge Banks looked genuinely unsettled. His jaw worked as if searching for words, but nothing came. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and Banks's carefully constructed facade was crumbling under the weight of the truth. The courtroom buzzed softly as everyone settled back into their seats, but something was palpably different. The charged energy from earlier had shifted, leaving an air of anticipation hanging thick in the room. Judge Marshall Banks, who had strutted into court that morning like a rooster in his barnyard, now seemed far less sure of himself. His usual commanding presence was replaced with something unrecognizable: hesitation. As he adjusted his robes and took his seat, Banks avoided Marcus's gaze entirely. He fidgeted with his gavel for a moment, tapping it lightly as though testing its weight. Finally, he cleared his throat and began, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. I've reviewed some additional information during the recess," Banks said, each word measured as though he were carefully walking across a minefield. "It seems General Hamilton's reputation precedes him." The room went still. Reporters paused, their pens hovering over notepads, ready to catch every syllable. A few cameras in the back adjusted their focus, lenses trained on the man who, moments earlier, had been the embodiment of arrogance. Now, he looked small. Marcus sat unmoving, his back straight and his expression unreadable. His piercing gaze was locked on Banks, but his demeanor betrayed nothing. No triumph, no smugness, just calm. It was the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've already won. Banks shifted in his seat, his discomfort as obvious as the beads of sweat forming on his brow. "General Hamilton," he continued, his voice strained, "I'd like to extend an apology. My earlier remarks were inappropriate. Your service to this country is beyond commendable, and it appears I was misinformed." The collective gasp from the gallery was audible. A few reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances, their fingers flying over keyboards as they captured the moment. The sight of Judge Banks, apologizing was something no one had expected to see in their lifetime. The man was practically a monument to stubborn pride, and here he was, eating his words. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. "Your apology is noted, Your Honor," he said, the words carrying the weight of someone who had seen and endured far too much to be easily placated. "But respect isn't about words, it's about actions. I hope this moment teaches us all something about assumptions and bias." The room was silent for a beat, the weight of Marcus's words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Then, slowly, a murmur of approval began to ripple through the gallery. A few people nodded, others exchanged knowing looks. Even the reporters, usually so detached and clinical, seemed moved. Judge Banks nodded stiffly, his face a complicated mixture of shame and reluctant gratitude. For once, his usual quick retorts and sharp commands were absent. He seemed shaken, fumbling his way through the remainder of the proceedings with none of his usual bravado. As the session adjourned, Marcus rose from his seat, his movements as composed and deliberate as ever. He walked toward the exit, his presence commanding the room without a single word. Then something unexpected happened. The gallery erupted into applause. The sound started small, a few claps here and there, but it quickly grew, swelling into a standing ovation. Witnesses, attorneys, court staff, nearly everyone rose to their feet. Even the stenographer, who rarely looked up from her machine, wiped at her eyes as she clapped softly. Marcus paused at the door, turning back to take one last look at the courtroom. His eyes swept the room, not in triumph, but in quiet reflection. He gave a small nod, acknowledging the moment, the people, and the change it symbolized, before stepping out into the bright sunlight beyond.